Thomas Hardy was born in 1840 in the village of Stinsford, which is in Dorset County in the UK. His father was a stonemason and a builder, and his mother was well-read, and she gave him the beginning of an education until he was about 8 when he started going to school. His family was relatively poor, so his formal education ended when he was 16, and he became an apprentice to a local architect. In 1862, so that's 6 years later, he's now 22 years old, he moved to London and enrolled in King's College. And despite winning some architectural prizes when he was there, Hardy apparently never really felt at home in London and was aware of class differences and his own low class. During that time, he became interested in the notion of social reform, and specifically in the writing of John Stuart Mill. And he had a friend introduce him to the writing of Auguste Comte and to that of Charles Fourier. In particular, Hardy was influenced by Mill's essay on liberty, at which we've looked on this podcast. And in 1924, Hardy said that, quote, "My pages show harmony of view," end quote, with Mill. Hardy was writing during the Victorian era, which is, of course, named after Queen Victoria, who reigned over the United Kingdom during that time. And he's considered a realist. He wrote a lot about rural life and criticized the declining status of rural people in Britain. He wrote a number of novels and a lot of poetry as well, and thought of himself as a poet first. Today we'll be looking at Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which was published in 1891. Frederic Delanger, who was an Anglo-French composer as well as a banker, wrote an Italian opera based on Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it was first performed in Naples in 1906. But unfortunately, Mount Vesuvius erupted, and that cut the run of the opera short. 3 years later, it was put on in London when Hardy was 69, and he attended the premiere. And I was not able to easily pull up any music from this opera, so I'm not sure if a recording still exists. I had certainly never heard of that composer, though some of his music is available on YouTube, just not specifically anything from his opera based on Tess of the D'Urbervilles. The novel initially appeared in a censored and serialized form in a weekly newspaper. This would have been in the 1890s. It received mixed reviews, and that was likely at least in part because of the controversial subject matter. The story is set in Wessex, which is a fictional part of England that Hardy used, but it is named after the real Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which was part of the Heptarchy, the period during which what is now the United Kingdom was ruled by 7 kingdoms, those being Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, Kent, Essex, Wessex, and Sussex. But Wessex existed from about the 6th century to the 10th century, and it is the kingdom of which Alfred the Great and others were king. And if you're interested in that period and in Alfred the Great in particular, I suggest you check out the episode of this podcast in which we look at the biography of Alfred the Great by Asser. And to wrap up this sticky note biography of him, Thomas Hardy died in 1928 at the age of 87 in, again, Dorset, which was the county of his birth, but he died in Dorchester. So he lived to a relatively old age. Doing this podcast, I've been noticing the different ages that these guys die at, and a lot of them don't make it close to 87, so good for him. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a novel, of course, that centers on this woman, Tess. And there is some tension in this story that you're not totally sure how it's going to resolve. So I'm going to do my best to avoid giving anything away and talking about this story. But as usual, even if I do reveal something, the main value of these older stories, I find, is very rarely the surprise ending or the twist. It's the picture of the whole story as a unified image of something. And even if somebody tells you the whole plot from the beginning, that doesn't replace the writer's work in depicting what he's talking about. And in some cases, it can even make the story easier to understand because you know a little bit about what to look for going in. You know the general outline of the story. So it can be harder to get lost, which is certainly possible in some novels. But what has made this novel last is not its complexity. It has a handful of main characters, and most of what Hardy writes is about Tess. and what she's feeling and thinking and how she looks from the outside to others. But the general setup is that there's this family, the Derbyfield family, and right at the beginning, the father in the family learns that he is a descendant of the d'Urberville line, which is an ancient, noble Norman family, and he's immediately very proud of this. They're not the Derbyfields, they're the d'Urbervilles. And so he goes out, and then the next day while he's sleeping it off, his eldest daughter, Tess, brings the horse and wagon to the market to sell some goods in his place. And when she's doing that, she falls asleep, and the wagon crashes, and the horse is killed. Without the horse, the family has a really hard time getting by, and so she agrees to go visit another branch of the d'Urberville family that lives nearby in order to ask them for work, not for straight money, but for a job to do for pay. And there's a detail there that I won't give away because it's not important for this summary. And when she goes there, a young man from this family, whose name is Alec, is first flirting with her and then coming on to her in a pretty strong way. And ultimately they have an encounter that is a little ambiguous, but I think he rapes her by the veiled wording that Hardy uses, though some people interpret it to have been consensual. And the rest of the story still makes sense either way, but I think it makes more sense in the former case. And perhaps I skipped that part. This happens after she's been accepted to work for the d'Urberville family. And she continues to work there for another month or two afterwards. She works basically for the summer. And then she leaves. And then after that, her life goes on for a while until another man comes into the picture. And things are eventually made complicated by this event in her past. And even from that very brief summary, you can see that this is a story that's largely centered on the position of women in society and the expectations on women, and in some cases how they're different from the expectations on men. We see right away Hardy's interest in class differences. She's a country girl. The men in the story are of a higher social class. In a certain way, it's centered around the very modern issue of the problems that arise from men and women working together. This is essentially an example of sexual harassment or assault in the workplace. And though it's not as obvious from the plot setup, the story also touches on religion and on industrialization, something that was going on in the UK in the 19th century, and how that affected the rural parts of the country. And while this was not exactly my favorite kind of book to read, I did get a lot out of it. For better or for worse, many books can be categorized into stories that women are more likely to enjoy versus stories that men are more likely to enjoy. And that might in part be because you enjoy reading about something that you can relate to. And women, of course, can relate better to the inner worlds and thinking of other women. And they might be more interested in the things toward which they turn their attention because women might turn their attention in the same way. And of course, this is not true in every case, but it is often true. But I do think this kind of literature, and this isn't a perfect example because this is, of course, written by a man, but it can help men to empathize with the position that women are often in society. And I think part of the reason why this book was censored and received mixed reviews was in part because of this difficult topic that it examines. And ironically, it might be kept off of reading lists today for the same reason. But I had this novel on my list for this year because I had heard good things about Thomas Hardy, and he certainly didn't disappoint. And if you are assigned a book like this and you find yourself saying, this is an interesting story, but did Mr. Hardy really need 544 pages to tell it? Then I might encourage you to think about classic novels in a different way. And that is that when we think of modern stories, we characterize them by the action. We say the events in the story, as I did earlier with the first 10 to 20% of this story. And we say that's what happened. That's what happens in that movie. That's what happens in this book. And I think that that might in part be because of Hollywood and film in general. Film is a visual medium, of course. And so it favors action. It can really only depict action. And when I say action, I don't mean guys jumping off a roof or something. I mean stuff happening physically. It cannot depict very effectively somebody's inner monologue. And it can depict emotion, obviously. But one of the things that writing can do is describe in very specific detail a very subtle situation in a way that I think film can't come close. Which is fine. Film can do other things very well. I don't think the mediums are equivalent. I think writing is superior. If for no other reason than writing makes you use your own imagination, it makes you use your brain in a way that film doesn't. But that's fine. Film is a little different. It has its own merits. But the way that we interpret film, the way that we explain a film, here's what happened, the guy went over there, he did this, and then this other guy showed up, whatever, has now bled over into how we characterize novels. And the thing is, if you go back to a 19th century novel and you look at it in the same way, then you go, it took 544 pages to tell this story that I could have condensed into an hour-and-a-half long movie, or even into a 25-page short story. Hit the high points, skip all the stuff in between, get out. And in a certain way, that's true. If you wanted to have a relatively detailed summary of a long novel, you could do that in 20 pages or so. But what you would be missing in part is the texture. And this is something that Hardy does very well. And texture is a word that I'm using for something I don't know exactly how to describe. But I mean the moment-to-moment, we might also say atmosphere of the story. All of the side information that contributes to this more detailed picture. If you condense a 500-page novel into 20 pages, you will by definition lose that. It's not possible to keep it. You'll have all the action, or most of it. You won't even have all of it. But you'll have the action that somebody says is, quote, most important to the story, end quote. But you will not have the work of observing and trying to convey the world through words. That is what a writer does. And you might say, well, I could just have less of that. Okay, let's not make it 20 pages, let's make it 40 pages and put some interesting observations or texture, or whatever Alex is talking about. Put some of that in there also. And even then you would have at best a sample of what you get from a longer novel. And this now brings me to the larger point that I'm trying to make about the way that we relate to older novels and older literature in general, and how it has been affected by modern media. And by media, I don't mean the news media, I mean the mediums, the media by which we have stories told to us. Film is certainly one, but tweets and TikTok videos are others. And someone who has been raised on tweets and TikTok videos and who no longer has the patience even to sit through a movie, much less read a book, will not have the ability to relate to a 19th century novel. It'll seem utterly alien to them. That doesn't mean that they can't learn how to relate to it. They can and they absolutely should, but they won't have been exposed to anything that resembles a 19th century novel, and so they won't know how to approach it. They'll open it up and it might as well be written in a foreign language. That's how much of it they'll be able to understand. And the reason is this. The level of magnification is different in a 19th century novel. A Hollywood movie is way zoomed out. And obviously not all movies are Hollywood movies, but most movies that people watch are Hollywood movies. And most TV shows that people watch are something comparable or worse. And the magnification is way zoomed out. And most people, because that's the level of magnification to which they've been exposed the most, they take that as the normal level. And I won't say that this level is normal and that one's not. I'll just say that if you're used to that level of magnification, then when you encounter something like a 19th century novel that takes a microscope to everything, that zooms way in on everything that happens, that takes more time with it, that sits in a scene not for 2 but for 20 pages, then you will have an emotional response that in common parlance is called being bored, which I don't quite know how to define yet, but the phrase that comes to mind right now is an addiction to novelty. You need things to change more often. It needs to change a lot. But if you look at a novel as an interesting short story with the magnification dialed way up, or to put it another way, with each scene expanded from being a stick figure drawing to an oil painting that would fill up a wall, and that what you're now doing is not keeping track of the action, what happened next, but exploring every inch of this oil painting. And then a little later, you move on to the next painting, because a novel maybe comprises 15 such big, complicated images. And in a certain way, reading a novel in this way is more a test of your own cognitive ability than watching a movie is. Watching a movie is very passive. Of course, you can still sit there and think about the story and this dialogue and why did the director choose to show it in this way. And if you know about cinematography, then you can think about and comment on all those technical choices. And of course, film is its own thing, and that's a skill that people put a lot of work into, and some people do it very well and some people do it badly. But it's much easier to be a completely passive audience member for a film than it is to be a completely passive reader, because if nothing else, when you're reading a book, you have to keep track of what's going on. If they mention a character again, you have to remember everything that that character has done so far. And doing that from simply reading the character's name is more difficult for whatever reason cognitively than seeing the person's face on a screen. A million years of evolution makes us go, oh, that guy, he did this thing, and now he's doing that. But you can take the reading of a novel as an exercise of your ability to examine, to investigate, to understand something. In Walden, Thoreau writes something like, books should be read with the same earnestness with which they were written. And there's no way that you're going to put more energy in reading it than the writer put into in writing it. You're not going to exhaust, depending on the book, of course, you're not going to exhaust a great book that people are still reading after 100 years in one reading. You're not going to make all the connections that the writer was thinking of. You're going to miss stuff, but you can use it among many other things, among all the other things that we talk about on this podcast, thinking about the ideas that the writer put forward. Are they true? Are they not? This person said this thing that was interesting. He made this connection that's worth thinking about. But you can also use it as a practice for yourself in trying to examine something very closely, something very complex with a lot of parts. You can be a kind of investigator of this story. What's going on? All right, this is what's going on the surface. I've kept track of all the facts, which in a complicated novel is difficult enough to do anyway. But then what might be going on behind that? What's the evidence of that? What's going on that the writer hasn't said, but maybe implied? And the value of this cognitive skill of investigating might be part of why classic literature has been central to the European system of education, alongside all the moral and historical and other information that you get from it. If you look at it in this way, then it's easier to understand the labor that Thomas Hardy put into a book like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it's easier to get a lot out of it. So with that in mind, we can now start to look at some passages from Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. The first passage that we're going to look at is a description of a country dance, and it mentions at the end 4 figures from Greek mythology. Those are Pan, Syrinx, Lotus, and Priapus. Pan is probably the best known of those 4. In Greek mythology, he was the god of the wild, of shepherds and flocks, rustic music, and impromptus, and he was a companion of the nymphs. And he had horns and the shape of a goat from the waist down. Then it mentions Syrinx, who was an Arcadian nymph and a follower of Artemis, who was the goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, wild animals, nature, vegetation, childbirth, the care of children, and of chastity. But when Pan pursued Syrinx, Syrinx fled into the Ladon River and, at her own request, was transformed into a reed that Pan then used to make his panpipes. Then there's Lotus, who is a nymph whom Ovid mentions. And then there's Priapus, who is a minor fertility god and the protector of livestock, fruit plants, gardens, and male genitalia. And knowing all of that adds a little color and detail to this scene that Hardy is describing. So here's that passage. Quote, approaching the hay trussers, she could hear the fiddled notes of a reel proceeding from some building in the rear, but no sound of dancing was audible, an exceptional state of things for these parts where as a rule the stamping drowned the music. The front door being opened, she could see straight through the house into the garden at the back as far as the shades of night would allow, and nobody appearing to her knock, she traversed the dwelling and went up the path to the outhouse whence the sound had attracted her. It was a windowless erection used for storage, and from the open door there floated into the obscurity a mist of yellow radiance, which at first Tess thought to be illuminated smoke. But on drawing nearer she perceived that it was a cloud of dust lit by candles within the outhouse, whose beams upon the haze carried forward the outline of the doorway into the wide night of the garden. When she came close and looked in, she beheld indistinct forms racing up and down to the figure of the dance, the silence of their footfalls arising from their being overshoe in scroff, that is to say, the powdery residuum from the storage of peat and other products, the stirring of which by their turbulent feet created the nebulosity that involved the scene. Through this floating, fusty debris of peat and hay, mixed with the perspirations and warmth of the dancers, and forming together a sort of vegeto-human pollen, the muted fiddles feebly pushed their notes in marked contrast to the spirit with which the measure was trodden out. They coughed as they danced, and laughed as they coughed. Of the rushing couples there could barely be discerned more than the highlights, the indistinctness shaping them to satyrs clasping nymphs, a multiplicity of Pans whirling a multiplicity of Syrinxes, Lotus attempting to elude Priapus, and always failing." End quote. And later, as they're going home, Hardy describes the group, quote, "Yet however terrestrial and lumpy their appearance just now to the mean unglamoured eye, to themselves the case was different. They followed the road with a sensation that they were soaring along in a supporting medium, possessed of original and profound thoughts, themselves and surrounding nature forming an organism of which all the parts harmoniously and joyously interpenetrated each other. They were as sublime as the moon and stars above them, and the moon and stars were as ardent as they." End quote. So in case you thought 19th century English peasants didn't have any fun, here's Hardy describing a scene in which they definitely did. Sounds like they had a nice night. And there's an element of fate in the story in that, without giving anything away, at that dance she encounters a guy with whom she doesn't speak at the time, but he comes back later in the story in a significant way. And things might have been different if they had spoken that night. And this next passage is where the rape or the extramarital sex happens, depending on how you read it. There are other hints in the story, besides just this, that makes me think it was not consensual. But I think this by itself tilts in that direction. Hardy writes, quote, "Why it was that upon this beautiful feminine tissue, sensitive as gossamer, and practically blank as snow as yet, there should have been traced such a coarse pattern as it was doomed to receive. Why so often the coarse appropriates the finer thus, the wrong man the woman, the wrong woman the man. Many thousand years of analytical philosophy have failed to explain to our sense of order. One may indeed admit the possibility of a retribution lurking in the present catastrophe. Doubtless some of Tess d'Urberville's mailed ancestors, rollicking home from a fray, had dealt the same measure even more ruthlessly towards peasant girls of their time. But though to visit the sins of the fathers upon the children may be a morality good enough for divinities, it is scorned by average human nature, and it therefore does not mend the matter. As Tess's own people down in those retreats are never tired of saying among each other in their fatalistic way, 'It was to be.' There lay the pity of it. An immeasurable social chasm was to divide our heroine's personality thereafter from that previous self of hers who stepped from her mother's door to try her fortune at Trantridge Poultry Farm." End quote. And notice how subtly he describes this. If you're not paying attention, you might miss that entirely. And it's maybe the most important event in the story. It then sets up the entire rest of the book. And she's only exposed to this situation because she leaves her parents' house to go somewhere else to find work at their direction. And Hardy speculates that it may have been retribution for the actions of Tess's mailed ancestors. He means the men in her family line who may have done the same thing 500 years ago in the Middle Ages to other peasant girls, and that maybe this was kind of a retribution for that. And he also refers to it as a catastrophe. And there are other passages where the mother says certain things to Tess that also make it seem that it was non-consensual. But I'd be willing to hear somebody making the case for the other side. Later, she goes home, and her mother was very hopeful that she would be able to get this young guy to marry her, and that would turn her fortunes and the family's fortunes around. And Tess explains to her what happened, though Hardy skips over the actual explanation, so we can't glean any clues from how she describes it. But the mother says, quote, "Any woman would have done it, but you after that," end quote. And she means any woman would have gotten him to marry them. And later there's an exchange between Tess's mother and her. Tess's mother says, quote, "You ought to have been more careful if you didn't mean to get him to make you his wife." "Oh, mother, my mother," cried the agonized girl, turning passionately upon her parent as if her poor heart would break. "How could I be expected to know? I was a child when I left this house 4 months ago. Why didn't you tell me there was danger in menfolk? Why didn't you warn me? Ladies know what to fend hands against because they read novels that tell them of these tricks. But I never had the chance of learning in that way, and you did not help me." Her mother was subdued. "I thought if I spoke of his fond feelings and what they might lead to, you would be hauntish with him and lose your chance," she murmured, wiping her eyes with her apron. End quote. And if you read or if you have read this story, you'll know that there are certain very important ways in which Tess is very active. But there's a rather sad way in which she is passive, in that there are these two main men in the story, and both of them approach her very persistently over a period of time, and she tries very hard to reject them repeatedly. And both men get to her in a certain way, one sexually, the other in another way, and her life is worsened in both cases. And as a reader, one is inclined to wish that they could have just left her alone. At one point, Tess goes to church, and Hardy has a nice little comment about composers. Quote, "Parishioners dropped in by twos and threes, deposited themselves in rows before her, rested 3/4 of a minute on their foreheads as if they were praying, though they were not. Then they sat up and looked around. When the chants came on, one of her favorites happened to be chosen among the rest, the old double chant Langdon, but she did not know what it was called, though she would much have liked to know. She thought, without exactly wording the thought, how strange and godlike was a composer's power, who from the grave could lead through sequences of emotion, which she alone had felt at first, a girl like her who had never heard of his name and never would have a clue to his personality." End quote. And a long time after this bad event has happened, Tess is working on a farm, and she is slowly processing what happened and perhaps coming to terms with it as much as she can, though Hardy always describes it in a general sense from the outside rather than really from in her own mind. So in that way, we always feel a kind of distance from Tess. It's not in the first person, and even the descriptions in the third person are not terribly close up. You always feel a little bit far from Tess and her thoughts. Hardy writes, quote, "But this encompassment of her own characterization, based on shreds of convention, peopled by phantoms and voices antipathetic to her, was a sorry and mistaken creation of Tess's fancy, a cloud of moral hobgoblins by which she was terrified without reason. It was they that were out of harmony with the actual world, not she. Walking among the sleeping birds in the hedges, watching the skipping rabbits on a moonlit warren, or standing under a pheasant-laden bough, she looked upon herself as a figure of guilt intruding into the haunts of innocence. But all the while she was making a distinction where there was no difference. Feeling herself in antagonism, she was quite in accord. She had been made to break an accepted social law, but no law known to the environment in which she fancied herself such an anomaly." End quote. In that passage, we're actually still seeing Hardy's thoughts about what she is thinking, rather than her own thoughts shifting. But he's talking about how this law that she broke, or that she was made to break, as he said. And again, you could still interpret that in two different ways. Either that she was made to break it in that she was raped, or she was made to break it in that she was seduced. But either way, Hardy is saying that this is a social law, and her behavior was not out of step with the nature that she was walking in. She's walking with these rabbits and birds, and she feels like that's innocence, and she's no longer innocent. And Hardy says, no, what happened was something that happens in nature, and she was also walking in nature. And she was only out of step with an accepted social law, not with the environment that she was in, meaning not with the natural world. And I feel a kind of helplessness about the message of this book in general, because on the one hand, there were certainly things that were not ideal about the sexual mores of Victorian England. And one of them might have been that if a woman is raped, then she's thereafter unmarriageable to a lot of people. And that's a very sad way of punishing a victim. And a lot of what this book was about, what I think Hardy was getting at, was to try to empathize with a woman in that position and to show her life and to show what it would be like to be her and to show in a rather detailed portrait how this is unfair. And it certainly is. But when you have a passage like this, and I think this might have been one of the sections that the censor didn't like, that the Obscene Publications Act of 1857 and its apparatus would have come down on, and apparently did. A passage that is saying that our social laws are actually unnatural, and when somebody breaks them, they're not breaking something that matters really, they're breaking an arbitrary thing that is itself out of step with nature. When you say that, on the one hand, first of all, it's not obvious that it's true, but I'm not going to go into a big deep thing about that. But let's assume that it's true. On the one hand, you have now made it so a woman who is raped before she's married should be empathized with. She shouldn't be rejected or excluded from the possibility of any kind of happy life because somebody did something terrible to her. But even after you've said that, if you say that our social conventions are arbitrary, then the door is still left open for things to continue to slide until they get to where we are today, which is that there are plenty of people who would argue that there is no social harm done at all by women or men, for that matter, having dozens of sexual partners, hundreds even, before they get married, consensual ones. So with this hazardous premise that our social conventions are arbitrary, which again is not demonstrated, and I don't think that it's true, from that premise, you can first maybe clean up something that's needlessly cruel in society, which is what much of Tess of the D'Urbervilles is about. But then you can also keep going in a rather unlimited way toward a set of social norms whose consequences are not clear, but which have never been adopted by any society for a long period of time in history. And I said I feel helpless because I wish I could tell Hardy all this, that I could go back to 1891 and say, I know you have good intentions and you're writing a nice book and you should keep doing that, but you should also know that this direction that you and a lot of other people like you are walking in, some other people are going to come after you, meaning they will come later and use this same premise to go to things that you would not like. And I don't think that that would make him burn the book. And I don't think that it should, because, again, the central premise of Tess of the D'Urbervilles remains valid even if you accept all of this. But he might have tried to limit what he was saying in a certain way, or put some guardrails on it somehow. This is sort of similar to how I felt about Hawthorne talking about technology, about railroads and the telegraph and electricity. He seemed unrestrainedly optimistic, where some caution might have helped, just because perhaps you can't imagine how things can go badly, because it's difficult to predict. A new technology comes in, or a new meme comes in, a meme like, don't reject women who were raped in their youth. It seems like a perfectly harmless meme. In fact, it seems like a great one, and it is. But it can be used in a bad way, or people can move forward seeming to use the same principle toward bad things. And the technology is similar. It seems great that you can shuffle people and things around very easily on a railroad, but you don't know necessarily what the negative impact of that might be, alongside the positive one. Later, Hardy writes, quote, she might have seen what had bowed her head so profoundly. The thought of the world's concern at her situation was founded on an illusion. She was not an existence, an experience, a passion, a structure of sensations, to anybody but herself. To all humankind besides, Tess was only a passing thought. Even to friends, she was more than a frequently passing thought. If she made herself miserable the lifelong night and day, it was only this much to them. Ah, she makes herself unhappy. If she tried to be cheerful, to dismiss all care, to take pleasure in the daylight, the flowers, the baby, she could only be this idea to them. Ah, she bears it very well. Moreover, alone in a desert island, would she have been wretched at what had happened to her? Not greatly. If she could have been just created, to discover herself as a spouseless mother, with no experience of life except as the parent of a nameless child, would the position have caused her to despair? No, she would have taken it calmly and found pleasure therein. Most of the misery had been generated by her conventional aspect and not by her innate sensations. End quote. This is an important reminder for anybody, not just for people who have gone through something terrible and they're worried about how people are judging them for it. That you are not an existence, an experience, a passion, a structure of sensations to anybody but yourself. To all humankind besides, you are only a passing thought. Even to friends, you are no more than a frequently passing thought. And that's not to say that our relationships don't matter, but if you're tormenting yourself about something, you don't need to do that, because you're probably doing it not for any actual reason. This is the part where what he's talking about, nature versus convention, does matter. Because there are conventional things that sometimes we can beat ourselves up about a lot. But if it weren't for those conventions, we wouldn't even notice. If we were living on a desert island, or if we just had to deal with the consequences of whatever it was, it's not that big a deal. You'll figure it out. If you, lose a bunch of money in some way or something, and so now you have to tighten the belt. That sort of sucks, but it's not that big a deal. If you're patient and you're not addicted to the things that money buys, then you'll figure it out and get through it. What's often much worse than that is how you think that people are perceiving you if you're going through some loss or something. There's that cliche that you would worry much less about what people think of you if you knew how little they do. Meaning, people are not thinking about you. You're thinking about you. People are thinking about their own problems. And you probably don't even know what those are. And if you torment yourself all day about something, then people will every once in a while go, oh, that's too bad. She's tormenting herself or he's tormenting himself. And that's it. That's all you're going to get out of that. So anyway, this is Hardy making that observation in 1891. One of the more active things that Tess does in the story is that after she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a child after the event, the baby gets sick and it's clear that he's going to die, and she cannot get a priest to the house quickly enough to baptize the child. And so then she baptizes the child herself, and she names her child Sorrow. But that was a solution that startled even me reading this book in 2023, that this peasant woman could just say, well, I'll do it. I'll baptize my own child. I don't need a priest to help me. I'll solve my own problem. And later there's a passage where Tess is more obviously starting to feel a little better. Hardy writes, quote, either the change in the quality of the air from heavy to light, or the sense of being amid new scenes where there were no invidious eyes upon her, sent up her spirits wonderfully. Her hopes mingled with the sunshine in an ideal photosphere which surrounded her as she bounded along against the soft south wind. She heard a pleasant voice in every breeze, and in every bird's note seemed to lurk a joy. Her face had latterly changed with changing states of mind, continually fluctuating between beauty and ordinariness, according as the thoughts were gay or grave. One day she was pink and flawless, another pale and tragical. When she was pink, she was feeling less than when pale. Her more perfect beauty accorded with her less elevated mood, her more intense mood with her less perfect beauty. It was her best face physically that was now set against the south wind. The irresistible, universal, automatic tendency to find sweet pleasure somewhere, which pervades all life, from the meanest to the highest, had at length mastered Tess. Being even now only a young woman of 20, one who mentally and sentimentally had not finished growing, it was impossible that any event should have left upon her an impression that was not in time capable of transmutation. And thus her spirits and her thankfulness and her hopes rose higher and higher. She tried several ballads but found them inadequate, till recollecting the psalter that her eyes had so often wandered over of a Sunday morning before she had eaten of the tree of knowledge, she chanted, O ye sun and moon, O ye stars, ye green things upon the earth, ye fowls of the air, beasts and cattle, children of men, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever. She suddenly stopped and murmured, but perhaps I don't quite know the Lord as yet. And probably the half-unconscious rhapsody was a fetishistic utterance in a monotheistic setting. Women, whose chief companions are the forms and forces of outdoor nature, retain in their souls far more of the pagan fantasy of their remote forefathers than of the systematized religion taught their race at later date. End quote. Then there's a nice passage about milking cows. Quote, when Tess had changed her bonnet for a hood and was really on her stool under the cow, and the milk was squirting from her fists into the pail, she appeared to feel that she really had laid a new foundation for her future. The conviction bred serenity. Her pulse slowed, and she was able to look about her. The milkers formed quite a little battalion of men and maids, the men operating on the hard-teated animals, the maids on the kindlier natures. It was a large dairy. There were nearly 100 milkers under Crick's management, all told. And of the herd, the master dairyman milked 6 or 8 with his own hands, unless away from home. These were the cows that milked hardest of all. For his journey milkmen being more or less casually hired, he would not entrust this half-dozen to their treatment, lest from indifference they should not milk them fully, nor to the maids, lest they should fail in the same way for lack of finger grip, with the result that in course of time the cows would go azoo, that is, dry up. It was not the loss for the moment that made slack milking so serious, but that with the decline of demand there came decline, and ultimately cessation, of supply. End quote. So there's something about milking cows, if you didn't know it, that if you don't milk the cow completely, then the cow will start to produce less milk next time, and ultimately stop producing milk. Also that some cows are harder to milk than others. Their udders are tougher somehow. This next passage deals with religion and philosophy, and it features Angel Clare, who is the second guy that Tess meets. Hardy writes, Quote, some 2 or 3 years before Angel's appearance at the Marlet dance, on a day when he had left school and was pursuing his studies at home, a parcel came to the vicarage from the local booksellers, directed to the Reverend James Clare. The vicar, having opened it and found it to contain a book, read a few pages, whereupon he jumped up from his seat and went straight to the shop with the book under his arm. Why has this been sent to my house? He asked peremptorily, holding up the volume. It was ordered, sir. Not by me, or anyone belonging to me, I'm happy to say. The shopkeeper looked into his order book. Oh, it has been misdirected, sir, he said. It was ordered by Mr. Angel Clare, and should have been sent to him. Mr. Clare winced as if he had been struck. He went home pale and dejected, and called Angel into his study. Look into this book, my boy, he said. What do you know about it? I ordered it, said Angel simply. What for? To read. How can you think of reading it? How can I? Why, it is a system of philosophy. There is no more moral or even religious work published. Yes, moral enough, I don't deny that, but religious, and for you, who intend to be a minister of the gospel. Since you have alluded to the matter, father, said the son, with anxious thought upon his face, I should like to say once for all that I should prefer not to take orders. I fear I could not conscientiously do so. I love the church as one loves a parent. I shall always have the warmest affection for her. There is no institution for whose history I have a deeper admiration. But I cannot honestly be ordained her minister, as my brothers are, while she refuses to liberate her mind from an untenable, redemptive theolatry. It had never occurred to the straightforward and simple-minded vicar that one of his own flesh and blood could come to this. He was stultified, shocked, paralyzed. And if Angel were not going to enter the church, what was the use of sending him to Cambridge? The university as a step to anything but ordination seemed, to this man of fixed ideas, a preface without a volume. End quote. So religiously, Angel is at odds with his father. His father's a vicar, his 2 brothers are priests, but he feels that he can't become a priest. His father later asks, quote, what is the good of your mother and me economizing and stinting ourselves to give you university education, if it is not to be used for the honor and glory of God? His father repeated. Why, that it may be used for the honor and glory of man, father. End quote. And Angel Clare, despite being an upper-class guy, is learning how to be a farmer. This is something that some guys of his station did. They were called gentleman farmers. And it doesn't sound like it was too bad a gig. But that's why he's spending time working on these farms, is not because he needs to earn money, but he's doing a kind of apprenticeship where he's spending time doing different aspects of farming so that he can learn how to do it. Ultimately, probably not so he can do it himself, but so he can manage other people doing it. Hardy writes of Angel, quote, unexpectedly, he began to like the outdoor life for its own sake, and for what it brought, apart from its bearing on his own proposed career. Considering his position, he became wonderfully free from the chronic melancholy which is taking hold of the civilized races, with the decline of belief in a beneficent power. For the first time of late years, he could read as his musings inclined him, without any eye to cramming for a profession, since the few farming handbooks which he deemed it desirable to master occupied him but little time. He grew away from old associations and saw something new in life and humanity. Secondarily, he made close acquaintance with phenomena which he had before known but darkly. The seasons and their moods, morning and evening, night and noon, winds and their different tempers, trees, waters and mists, shades and silences, and the voices of inanimate things. End quote. Later, Tess and Angel are flirting. They're talking. Angel's obviously interested in her. She's resisting. And during that period, he has a thought about her. Quote, it was amazing indeed to find how great a matter the life of the obscure dairy had become to him. And though new love was to be held partly responsible for this, it was not solely so. Many besides Angel have learnt that the magnitude of lives is not as to their external displacements, but as to their subjective experiences. The impressionable peasant leads a larger, fuller, more dramatic life than the pachydermatous king. Looking at it thus, he found that life was to be seen of the same magnitude here as elsewhere. Despite his heterodoxy, faults, and weaknesses, Clare was a man with a conscience. Tess was no insignificant creature to toy with and dismiss, but a woman living her precious life, a life which to herself, who endured or enjoyed it, possessed as great a dimension as the life of the mightiest to himself. Upon her sensations the whole world depended to Tess. Through her existence, all her fellow creatures existed to her. The universe itself only came into being for Tess on the particular day in the particular year in which she was born. This consciousness upon which he had intruded was the single opportunity of existence ever vouchsafed to Tess by an unsympathetic first cause. Her all, her every and only chance. How then should he look upon her as of less consequence than himself, as a pretty trifle to caress and grow weary of, and not deal in the greatest seriousness with the affection which he knew that he had awakened in her, so fervid and so impressionable as she was under her reserve, in order that it might not agonize and wreck her." End quote. And here I think Hardy is objecting a bit to the class divisions in London, maybe to some comments he heard or a perspective that he observed, that people who live in the country, people who live in rural areas are somehow less significant. They're leading less important lives than more supposedly important people elsewhere. Angel Claire, and in that passage and elsewhere, sometimes he's just referred to as Claire, comes out to this rural environment and he realizes that you can have a full life out here, that life is subjective in a way that he didn't understand, that in fact a rural life can be more full than the life of a supposedly more important person according to some kind of external measurement, which is an observation in general about life. And then he expands that onto this young woman, Tess, with whom he's talking. And it makes him take her more seriously also. That for her, the entire universe only exists through this medium of her life. And this is the only life that she has. And so you can't come in and wreck it and leave, which is obviously a completely different perspective than the one that Alec, the other guy who raped her, it's the total opposite perspective than the one that he had. Then there's an interesting description of Angel's two brothers. Quote, "After breakfast, he walked with his two brothers, non-evangelical, well-educated, hall-marked young men, correct to their remotest fiber. Such unimpeachable models as are turned out yearly by the lathe of a systematic tuition. They were both somewhat short-sighted, and when it was the custom to wear a single eyeglass and string, they wore a single eyeglass and string. When it was the custom to wear a double glass, they wore a double glass. When it was the custom to wear spectacles, they wore spectacles straight away, all without reference to the particular variety of defect in their own vision. When Wordsworth was enthroned, they carried pocket copies, and when Shelley was belittled, they allowed him to grow dusty on their shelves. When Correggio's holy families were admired, they admired Correggio's holy families. When he was decried in favor of Velasquez, they sedulously followed suit without any personal objection." End quote. So his two brothers are conformists to the extent that it seems that they almost don't have their own opinions about anything. At one point when things are developing with Angel, and it seems that they might get married, Tess writes to her mother and asks her if she should tell him what happened. And her mother writes back and says, quote, "Many a woman, some of the highest in the land, have had a trouble in their time. And why should you trumpet yours when others don't trumpet theirs? No girl would be such a fool, especially as it is so long ago, and not your fault at all. I shall answer the same if you ask me 50 times. End quote. The censor might not have liked that either. Hardy calling attention to the likelihood, we could almost say the fact, that things like rape and women having had some kind of sexual encounter before they were married was certainly more common than was known, just as a matter of fact. There's no way that every single encounter was known. And passages like this next one give us an example of what makes a good writer unique. One of the things about writing as an art form is that everybody has the same words available to them. Everybody who speaks English has all of the same English words available to them with which they can make something. There's no separation of, as in the case with oil painting, you can have a greater variety of paints or more high quality brushes, though those things are not a terribly big deal today. If you have a couple $100, you can get yourself more or less the best equipment that you would need to make an oil painting. That wasn't necessarily the case 200 years ago, though of course one could argue that also paper and ink were more expensive in the past as well. But if you go to the trouble of developing your vocabulary, then you have the same words that everybody else has as a writer. And what sets a great writer apart is their imagination in the use of those words. And that in part comes from a skill in observation, being able to see things that others don't see. And this next passage is just a couple sentences that makes gnats very interesting. Quote, "The meads were changing now, but it was still warm enough in early afternoons before milking to idle there a while, and the state of dairy work at this time of year allowed a spare hour for idling. Looking over the damp sod in the direction of the sun, a glistening ripple of gossamer webs was visible to their eyes under the luminary, like the track of moonlight on the sea. Gnats, knowing nothing of their brief glorification, wandered across the shimmer of this pathway, irradiated as if they bore fire within them, then passed out of its line. and were quite extinct, end quote. And another mark of a great writer is the ability to make an uninteresting subject interesting. If you have a story that's about the end of the world and battles between whatever, superheroes, something, then that's inherently interesting. Or maybe not interesting exactly, but it kind of hacks the attention. It immediately grabs the attention. People can't help but at least come and take a look at what you're talking about, what story you're telling. And you could even deal with it badly, and you'll still get some people's attention. But writing about gnats isn't like that, even one sentence. You have to have more artistic and creative power to turn anyone's attention toward gnats for even a short period. Here's another nice description of nature from Thomas Hardy. Quote, "Returning from one of these dark walks, they reached a great gravel cliff immediately over the levels, where they stood still and listened. The water was now high in the streams, squirting through the weirs, and tinkling under culverts. The smallest gullies were all full. There was no taking shortcuts anywhere, and foot passengers were compelled to follow the permanent ways. From the whole extent of the invisible vale came a multitudinous intonation. It forced upon their fancy that a great city lay below them, and that the murmur was the vociferation of its populace. It seems like tens of thousands of them," said Tess, "holding public meetings in their marketplaces, arguing, preaching, quarreling, sobbing, groaning, praying, and cursing." End quote. Later in the story, Alec and Tess go to a house, and there's a weird painting in the house. Quote, "But he found that the moldy old habitation somewhat depressed his bride. When the carriage was gone, they ascended the stairs to wash their hands, the charwoman showing the way. On the landing, Tess stopped and started. 'What's the matter?' said he. 'Those horrid women,' she answered with a smile. 'How they frightened me.' He looked up and perceived 2 life-size portraits on panels built into the masonry. As all visitors to the mansion are aware, these paintings represent women of middle age, of a date some 200 years ago, whose lineaments once seen can never be forgotten. The long pointed features, narrow eye, and smirk of the one, so suggestive of merciless treachery. The bill-hook nose, large teeth, and bold eye of the other, suggesting arrogance to the point of ferocity, haunt the beholder afterwards in his dreams. 'Whose portraits are those?' asked Claire of the charwoman. 'I have been told by old folk that they were ladies of the d'Urberville family, the ancient lords of this manor,' she said. 'Owing to their being builded into the wall, they can't be moved away.' The unpleasantness of the matter was that, in addition to their effect upon Tess, her fine features were unquestionably traceable in these exaggerated forms." End quote. So this unpleasant painting of these 2 women is a portrait of 2 women from the d'Urberville family. And the 2 women, though being sort of frightening, a little bit mocking, a little bit arrogant, also resemble Tess in a certain way. Then Tess puts on some nice clothes, and there's a description of the effect that that has, and also this class tension. Quote, "As everybody knows, fine feathers make fine birds. A peasant girl, but very moderately prepossessing to the casual observer in her simple condition and attire, will bloom as an amazing beauty if clothed as a woman of fashion with the aids that art can render. While the beauty of the midnight crush would often cut but a sorry figure if placed inside the field woman's wrapper upon a monotonous acreage of turnips on a dull day." He had never till now estimated the artistic excellence of Tess's limbs and features. "If you were only to appear in a ballroom," he said. "But no, dearest, I think I love you best in the wing bonnet and cotton frock. Yes, better than in this, well as you support these dignities." End quote. So he says that if you took an ordinary peasant woman and dressed her up in nice clothes, she'd look very nice. And if you took the most beautiful woman and put her in peasant clothes in a turnip field, she wouldn't look very special. And here, when Tess puts on nicer clothes, Angel can see her beauty more clearly, but he still prefers, or says that he prefers, her in her ordinary farm clothes. This next passage mentions the Cistercians, and the Cistercian order was a Christian order. It's sometimes called Catholic, but I think it's a little strange to call something Catholic before the Reformation, because at that time it was just Christian. If you call all of Middle Ages Christianity Catholic, you're anticipating a divide that didn't exist yet. At that time it was just what Christianity was. But so the Cistercians split off from the Benedictines, and the order was formed in 1098, the very late 11th century. Hardy writes, quote, "They had rambled round by a road which led to the well-known ruins of the Cistercian abbey behind the mill, the latter having in centuries past been attached to the monastic establishment. The mill still worked on, food being a perennial necessity. The abbey had perished, creeds being transient. One continually sees the ministration of the temporary, outlasting the ministration of the eternal." End quote. There's a description of Angel, starting with Tess crying. Quote, "She broke into sobs and turned her back to him. It would almost have won round any man but Angel Clare. Within the remote depths of his constitution, so gentle and affectionate as he was in general, there lay hidden a hard, logical deposit, like a vein of metal in a soft loam, which turned the edge of everything that attempted to traverse it. It had blocked his acceptance of the church. It blocked his acceptance of Tess. Moreover, his affection itself was less fire than radiance, and with regard to the other sex, when he ceased to believe, he ceased to follow, contrasting in this with many impressionable natures who remain sensuously infatuated with what they intellectually despise. He waited till her sobbing ceased." End quote. And similarly, quote, "Tess stole a glance at her husband. He was pale, even tremulous. But as before, she was appalled by the determination revealed in the depths of this gentle being she had married. The will to subdue the grosser to the subtler emotion, the substance to the conception, the flesh to the spirit. Propensities, tendencies, habits were as dead leaves upon the tyrannous wind of his imaginative ascendancy." End quote. Later, when Claire is trying to figure something out, Hardy writes, quote, "His conduct during these first weeks had been desultory beyond description. After mechanically attempting to pursue his agricultural plans as though nothing unusual had happened, in the manner recommended by the great and wise men of all ages, he concluded that very few of those great and wise men had ever gone so far outside themselves as to test the feasibility of their counsel. This is the chief thing. Be not perturbed," said the pagan moralist. That was just Claire's own opinion, but he was perturbed. "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid," said the Nazarene. Claire chimed in cordially, but his heart was troubled all the same. How he would have liked to confront those two great thinkers and earnestly appeal to them as fellow man to fellow men, and ask them to tell him their method. His mood transmuted itself into a dogged indifference till at length he fancied he was looking on his own existence with the passive interest of an outsider. End quote. And that first quote, "This is the chief thing, be not perturbed," is Marcus Aurelius. And there's another description of how Claire is thinking about Tess. Quote, "This night the woman of his belittling deprecations was thinking how great and good her husband was. But over them both there hung a deeper shade than the shade which Angel Clare perceived, namely, the shade of his own limitations. With all his attempted independence of judgment, this advanced and well-meaning young man, a sample product of the last 25 years, was yet the slave to custom and conventionality when surprised back into his early teachings. No prophet had told him, and he was not prophet enough to tell himself, that essentially this young wife of his was as deserving of the praise of King Lemuel as any other woman endowed with the same dislike of evil, her moral value having to be reckoned not by achievement but by tendency. Moreover, the figure near at hand suffers on such occasion because it shows up its sorriness without shade, while vague figures afar off are honored in that their distance makes artistic virtues of their stains. In considering what Tess was not, he overlooked what she was, and forgot that the defective can be more than the entire." End quote. And then there's another point where they've separated and Tess is thinking. Quote, "Such sleep as she got was naturally fitful. She fancied she heard strange noises, but persuaded herself that they were caused by the breeze. She thought of her husband in some vague warm clime on the other side of the globe, while she was here in the cold. Was there another such wretched being as she in the world? Tess asked herself, and thinking of her wasted life, said, 'All is vanity.' She repeated the words mechanically, till she reflected that this was a most inadequate thought for modern days. Solomon had thought as far as that more than 2,000 years ago. She herself, though not in the van of thinkers, had got much further. If all were only vanity, who would mind it? All was, alas, worse than vanity. Injustice, punishment, exaction, death. The wife of Angel Clare put her hand to her brow, and felt its curve, and the edges of her eye sockets perceptible under the soft skin, and thought as she did so that a time would come when that bone would be bare. 'I wish it were now,' she said." End quote. Later, she's observing nature again. Quote, "In time she reached the edge of the vast escarpment below, which stretched the loamy vale of Blackmore, now lying misty and still in the dawn. Instead of the colorless air of the uplands, the atmosphere down there was a deep blue. Instead of the great enclosures of 100 acres in which she was now accustomed to toil, there were little fields below her of less than a half a dozen acres, so numerous that they looked from this height like the meshes of a net. Here the landscape was whitey brown, down there as in Froome Valley it was always green. Yet it was in that vale that her sorrow had taken shape, and she did not love it as formerly. Beauty to her, as to all who have felt, lay not in the thing, but in what the thing symbolized, end quote. And she says later, quote, I say in all earnestness that it is a shame for parents to bring up their girls in such dangerous ignorance of the gins and nets that the wicked may set for them, whether their motive be a good one or the result of simple indifference, end quote. And that remains as relevant today as it was in 1891. And there are some interesting passages about the effect of industrialization, of the work that Tess is doing at one point. Hardy writes, quote, the old men on the rising straw rick talked of the past days when they had been accustomed to thresh with flails on the oaken barn floor, when everything, even to winnowing, was effected by hand labor, which to their thinking, though slow, produced better results. Those, too, on the corn rick talked a little, but the perspiring ones at the machine, including Tess, could not lighten their duties by the exchange of many words. It was the ceaselessness of the work which tried her so severely, and began to make her wish that she had never come to Flintcomb. The women on the cornrick, Marion, who was one of them in particular, could stop to drink ale or cold tea from the flagon now and then, or to exchange a few gossiping remarks while they wiped their faces or cleared the fragments of straw and husk from their clothing. But for Tess there was no respite, for as the drum never stopped, the man who fed it could not stop, and she, who had to supply the man with untied sheaves, could not stop either, unless Marion changed places with her, which she sometimes did for half an hour in spite of Groby's objections that she was too slow-handed for a feeder, end quote. So the guys who had been doing the threshing without the machine say they did it better by hand even though it was slower, and also Tess is unable to ever take a break because the machine is always working, so she also has to work without stopping. And another similar passage, quote, however, all the mutations so increasingly discernible in village life did not originate entirely in the agricultural unrest. A depopulation was also going on. The village had formerly contained, side by side with the agricultural laborers, an interesting and better informed class, ranking distinctly above the former, the class to which Tess's father and mother had belonged, and including the carpenter, the smith, the shoemaker, the huckster, together with the nondescript workers other than farm laborers, a set of people who owed a certain stability of aim and conduct to the fact of their being lifeholders like Tess's father, or copyholders, or occasionally small freeholders. But as the long holdings fell in, they were seldom again let to similar tenants, and were mostly pulled down, if not absolutely required by the farmer for his hands. Cottagers who were not directly employed on the land were looked upon with disfavor, and the banishment of some starved the trade of others, who were thus obliged to follow. These families, who had formed the backbone of the village life in the past, who were the depositories of the village traditions, had to seek refuge in the large centers. The process, humorously designated by statisticians as the tendency of the rural population towards the large towns, being really the tendency of water to flow uphill when forced by machinery, end quote. So in that short passage, he's describing how the English villages are being drained by the copyholders, freeholders, or lifeholders, people who have access, have ownership of land for a set period. When that period is up, they're then not being renewed, and the ownership goes to somebody else, to a larger landholder. And then those people are forced to move to the bigger cities. And then the other people who depended on those people for trade, to do business with them, even though their land was not necessarily affected, once the farmers are gone, then those tradesmen have to go to the cities also. And the statisticians have this nice, clean phrase for this, the tendency of the rural population towards the large towns, as if it's a natural thing that's occurring. And Hardy says that, in fact, it's more like water being pumped uphill. It's completely unnatural, but policy is forcing it to happen. And one last short passage, quote, thus the Derby fields, once D'Urbervilles, saw descending upon them the destiny which, no doubt, when they were among the Olympians of the county, they had caused to descend many a time, and severely enough, upon the heads of such landless ones as they themselves were now. So do flux and reflux, the rhythm of change, alternate and persist in everything under the sky, end quote. Those are the passages that I wanted to read you from Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com. The link is in the description, and order yourself a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I printed. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, of course, another 19th century novel, and it's generally taken as the origin of the entire genre of science fiction. It is fast-paced, full of interesting things to think about and talk about. I have it at a good price with free shipping, excellent print quality, original cover art, 97 footnotes throughout the book that explain some of the more obscure literary, historical, geographical references that Mary Shelley makes, some of the higher vocabulary words that she uses so that you don't have to go and look them up yourself, so you can read the book more quickly and easily. This is a book that I think every thinking person should read. If you haven't read it yourself, you should definitely order a copy now and do so. If you have read it, but you don't own a copy, you should still order yourself a copy. My edition is now the one that I have on my bookshelf. That was one of my goals in printing this, was I wanted to make an edition of Frankenstein that I could keep for myself, and I succeeded in doing that. But if you don't own a copy, you should. If you have read it and you own a copy, you should order a copy for a friend or a family member. It makes an excellent gift so that they can benefit from this great work of literature. As a publisher, I have the advantage of only printing books that I believe in and that I think that you would both take pleasure in and benefit from reading. And I chose to print Frankenstein for exactly that reason. I think you will both enjoy and benefit from this book. So do yourself a favor, go over and pick yourself up a copy right now. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.